Among philosophers who have claimed to prove that God exists, a small minority has claimed to prove that God exists without appealing to any observations of the world. Proofs of this sort are called ontological arguments. These are arguments for God's existence whose premises are purportedly justified from some source other than observation of the world, for example, from reason alone. The majority of philosophers think that ontological arguments generally don't work, but it's often quite difficult to pinpoint exactly where and why they go wrong. In this video, I'll tour 4 prominent ontological arguments and explore one significant pitfall afflicting each such argument. I won't be doing this alone, though, as I'll be drawing on Graham Oppy's excellent article on ontological arguments published in the Philosophers' Magazine. For the sake of brevity, Oppy limited himself to only one significant problem for each of the 4 ontological arguments. Note, though, that there are many more problems for ontological arguments. For more on that, I highly recommend watching the videos in my ontological arguments playlist. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we are of course covering ontological arguments from Anselm to Gödel. The first and best-known ontological argument was proposed by Saint Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century. In its Proslogion, Anselm claims to derive the existence of that than which no greater can be conceived, from the mere concept of that than which no greater can be conceived, or, in short, the greatest conceivable being. Anselm reasoned that if such a being doesn't really exist, then a greater being, namely, a being than which no greater can be conceived and which does really exist, can be conceived. But that would be absurd, right? You can't conceive of a being greater than a being than which no greater can be conceived. Right? If this is the greatest conceivable being, then you can't conceive of a being greater than it. And yet, if such a being doesn't really exist, you can conceive of a being greater than it, namely one just like it, but that actually exists. Hence, a being than which no greater can be conceived really exists. And, very plausibly, if that than which no greater can be conceived exists, then that being is God, and hence God exists. Let's hear the argument from Anselm himself. We believe that you are that than which no greater can be conceived. Or can it be that a thing of such a nature does not exist, since the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God? But surely when this same fool hears what I am speaking about, namely, that than which no greater can be conceived, he understands what he hears, and what he understands is in his understanding. Even the fool, then, is forced to agree that that than which no greater can be conceived exists in the understanding. And surely that than which no greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone. For if it exists solely in the understanding, it can be conceived to exist in reality also, which is greater. If, then, that than which no greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, this same that than which no greater can be conceived is that than which a greater can be conceived, but that's obviously impossible. And therefore, there's absolutely no doubt that that than which no greater can be conceived exists both in the understanding and in reality. You can see here how he's kind of setting up the reductio. He's saying, suppose that that than which no greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone. Well, then we get an absurdity on that assumption. The absurdity is that we can conceive of something greater than that than which no greater can be conceived. And that's just obviously impossible. And so since we know that that than which no greater can be conceived does exist in the understanding, and we just showed by reductio that that than which no greater can be conceived can't exist in the understanding alone, that is, in the understanding alone and not also in reality, it follows that that than which no greater can be conceived exists in reality. So again, the basic idea here is that if a being than which no greater can be conceived doesn't actually exist, then we can conceive of a being greater than a being than which no greater can be conceived, namely, a being than which no greater can be conceived that also exists. And that's absurd. We cannot conceive of a being greater than a being than which no greater can be conceived, and hence a being than which no greater can be conceived exists. That's perhaps the simplest and most straightforward gloss on Anselm's argument. Fast forward 6 centuries, and another ontological argument bursts onto the scene, this time from French philosopher René Descartes, or René Descartes. Sorry, I'm not French, so that was probably butchered. Proper American butchering. In 1641, in his Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes argued as follows. Meditaciones de prima filosofia. So Descartes writes, I clearly see that existence can no more be separated from the essence of God than can its having 3 angles equal to 2 right angles be separated from the idea of a rectilinear triangle, or the idea of a mountain from the idea of a valley. and so there is no less repugnance to our conceiving a God, that is, a being supremely perfect, to whom existence is lacking, that is to say, to whom a certain perfection is lacking, than to conceive of a mountain which has no valley. From the fact that I cannot conceive God without existence, it follows that existence is inseparable from him, and hence that he really exists. That then is how Descartes articulates his argument. The basic idea is the following. The very idea of God is the idea of a being with every perfection. But existence is a perfection, and hence the very idea of God is the idea of a being that exists. From this, Descartes thinks, it follows that God exists. Now, why do most philosophers find these two arguments uncompelling? Well, one reason is that, were these arguments compelling, we would have equally compelling arguments for the existence of things that we know don't exist. In 1079, Gödel, a monk at the same monastery as Anselm, claimed that, following Anselm's lead, we can construct an equally compelling argument for the existence of that island than which no greater island can be conceived. And in 1641, Johann Descartes claimed that, following Descartes' lead, you can construct an equally compelling argument from the mere idea of an existent lion to the existence of at least one lion. After all, the very idea of an existent lion, just like the very idea of God, according to Descartes, includes existence. If the fact that the idea of something includes existence commits us to the reality of that thing, then we'll be committed to the reality of lions just by virtue of thinking about lions from the armchair. But that is surely absurd. Surely we can't prove the existence of lions by pure thought alone. After all, we could run the same sort of reasoning with unicorns, or evil gods, or fairies, or Bigfoot, and so much more. Now, because the precise details of the objections from Gödel and Descartes are somewhat controversial, let's rework their objections using a different example. Suppose that I've just completed a test on which the maximum conceivable score and the maximum possible score is 100%. Consider first that score by me on the test than which no greater score by me on the test is conceivable. When you hear the words, that score by me on the test than which no greater score by me on the test is conceivable, you understand them. So, according to Anselm, that score by me on the test than which no greater score by me on the test is conceivable exists in the understanding. But, by Anselm's lights, that score by me on the test than which no greater score by me on the test is conceivable cannot exist in the understanding alone. For, if it exists solely in the understanding, it can be conceived to exist in reality also, which is greater. If then, that score by me on the test than which no greater score by me on the test is conceivable exists in the understanding alone, this same that score by me on the test than which no greater score by me on the test is conceivable is that score by me on the test than which a greater score by me on the test is conceivable. And that is obviously impossible. And therefore, by Anselm's lights, there is absolutely no doubt that that score by me on the test than which no greater score by me on the test is conceivable exists both in the understanding and in reality. Which is to say that, by Anselm's lights, there is no doubt that I got 100% on the test. After all, that's just what it is for the score by me on the test than which no greater score by me on the test is conceivable to exist in reality. But that is absurd. That is an absurd conclusion, right? It's perfectly consistent with everything I told you that I crashed and burned on the test. We could even suppose that I, in fact, got like a 32% on the test. Using Anselm's reasoning, though, we will have concluded that I actually got a 100% on the test. You can see the parity or the symmetry between these sorts of arguments. If you accept this argument, it seems as though you are inexorably led to accepting this argument, and yet this argument proceeds to a conclusion which is flatly absurd. And so we ultimately shouldn't accept Anselm's argument. It must go wrong somewhere. So again, the basic idea of Anselm's argument was, if that than which no greater can be conceived exists solely in the understanding, we get a contradiction. Why is that? Well, because then we'd be able to conceive of something greater than that than which no greater can be conceived, namely a being just like it, but that actually exists. But equally, we can run the exact same reasoning in terms of that score by me on the test than which no greater score by me on the test is conceivable. If that exists solely in the understanding, then we get a contradiction. Because then, that score by me on the test than which no greater score by me on the test is conceivable would actually be such that we can conceive of a greater score by me on the test, namely one just like it, but that actually exists. And so we conclude that that score by me on the test, than which no greater score by me on the test is conceivable, must exist not just in the understanding, but also in reality. But the problem again is that that conclusion is absurd. If I actually got a 32% on the test, which we can suppose I did, then it's obviously false to say that my score was actually 100%. Anselm's argument must have gone wrong somewhere. Now consider a supremely perfect score for me on the test. Such a score has two dimensions. First, it is a maximal score, namely 100%, otherwise it wouldn't be a supremely perfect score for me on the test. And secondly, it really exists, right? For example, it's not just a figment of my imagination that I got 100% on the test. Again, if it didn't actually exist, it wouldn't be a supremely perfect score for me on the test. Just as Descartes says, if God doesn't exist, then he wouldn't really be a supremely perfect being. Right? Existence adds to or contributes to greatness or perfection. This is precisely what Descartes himself is relying on. So, by Descartes' lights, it seems, we can see that existence can no more be separated from the concept of a supremely perfect score for me on the test than the idea of a mountain can be separated from the idea of a valley. There is no less repugnance to our conceiving a supremely perfect score for me on the test to which existence is lacking than to conceive a mountain which has no valley. By Descartes' lights, then, from the fact that I cannot conceive a supremely perfect score for me on the test which lacks existence, it's going to follow that existence is inseparable from it, and hence that it really exists. That is, by Descartes' lights, I really got a 100% on the test. But, as we noted earlier, that is absurd. It's perfectly possible, and we can suppose actual, that I bombed the test. So the general parody objection set out here is subtle and often misunderstood. In particular, it's important to understand what's not being claimed in setting out this objection. It's certainly not being claimed that we should accept the conclusion of the arguments for the existence of that score by me on the test than which no greater score by me on the test is conceivable, or the existence of a supremely perfect score by me on the test. Again, we could stipulate if we like that I got a 32% on the test. Given that stipulation, the conclusion of the parallel arguments is false. In particular, then, these arguments cannot be proofs of their conclusion, and by parity of argumentation, the original arguments from Anselm and Descartes likewise cannot be proofs of their conclusions. It's also certainly not being claimed that there is reason here to suppose that God doesn't exist. Right? Had I scored 100% on the test, then there would have existed, in reality, that score by me on the test, than which no greater score by me on the test is conceivable. And furthermore, there would have existed, in reality, a supremely perfect score by me on the test. But my getting 100% on the test would not have made the parallel arguments into good arguments, right? The important point here is that the arguments are not compelling. Nothing at all need be said about whether the conclusions of those arguments are true. And similarly, rejection of the claim that these ontological arguments are proofs of the existence of God is completely independent of the stance that one takes on the question whether God exists. Now, there's a common reply to the parity objection set out here that's worth discussing. Perhaps Anselm could say that whether the expression, that score by me on the test, than which no greater score by me on the test is conceivable, perhaps Anselm could say that whether that expression is understood depends upon whether that score by me on the test, than which no greater score by me on the test is conceivable, exists in reality. And perhaps Descartes can say that whether we have the idea of a supremely perfect score by me on the test depends upon whether there is, in reality, a perfect score by me on the test. If they could say these things, then Anselm could deny that there is, in the understanding, a score by me on the test than which no greater score by me on the test is conceivable. And likewise, Descartes could deny that we even have the idea of a supremely perfect score by me on the test. Alas, that response quite clearly won't do. After all, if Anselm and Descartes were entitled to go that way, then those who deny that there is in reality that than which no greater being can be conceived would likewise be entitled to deny that than which no greater being can be conceived exists even in the understanding. And similarly, those who deny that there is in reality a supremely perfect being would be entitled to deny that they even have the idea of a supremely perfect being. Right? It's not as if the words, that than which no greater being can be conceived, or supremely perfect being have magic properties that the words, that score by me on the test than which no greater score by me on the test can be conceived, or supremely perfect score by me on the test, don't have. So if Anselm and Descartes can avail themselves of that response that, well, whether we actually understand these terms depends on whether there really is, in reality, something satisfying them, well, then we can equally say, in response to Anselm and Descartes, that whether we even understand the supremely perfect being, or that than which no greater can be conceived, depends on whether there is such a thing in reality. And so then, no one who isn't antecedently inclined to accept that there is such a thing would ever be convinced of their argument, in which case their argument would likewise fail, in the sense that their argument would not constitute a successful, non-question-begging demonstration of the existence of God. Now, contemporary proponents of ontological arguments very rarely defend either Anselm's Proslogion 2 argument or Descartes' Meditation 5 argument. Instead, they typically defend a modal ontological argument or a higher-order ontological argument. And even many contemporary proponents of ontological arguments explicitly state that they don't establish their conclusions. Alvin Plantinga, for instance, says precisely this of the modal ontological argument. Still, though, Plantinga thinks that it can serve some beneficial philosophical purposes, and so it's worth addressing the argument here. So modal ontological arguments depend upon widely, but not universally, accepted claims about possibility, contingency, necessity, and actuality. That's where they get their name, modal ontological arguments. Modality is the study of possibility, contingency, necessity, and actuality. So among actually true claims, we can distinguish between contingently true claims, on the one hand, which are claims that happen to be true but could have been false, for example, that I had cereal for breakfast this morning, and on the other hand, necessarily true claims, which are claims that could not have been false, for example, that 2 + 2 = 4. Similarly, among actually false claims, we can distinguish between contingently false claims, those that happen to be false but could have been true, for example, that I did not have cereal for breakfast this morning, and on the other hand, necessarily false claims, which are those that could not possibly be true, for example, that 2 + 2 = 5. Every claim has one of the just identified modal statuses. Some claims are necessarily true, some claims are necessarily false. Some claims are contingently true, and other claims are contingently false. These are exclusive and exhaustive categorizations. Claims that are necessarily true are also both possibly true and actually true. If something must be the case, then clearly it's actually the case, and clearly also it could be the case. Likewise, claims that are necessarily false are both possibly false and actually false. And it's also worth noting here that necessity and possibility are interdefinable. A claim is necessarily true, or necessary for short, just in case it's not possible that it's false. Right? Its falsity is impossible, which is to say that it's necessarily true, it's necessary. And likewise, a claim is possibly true, or possible for short, just in case it's not necessary that it's false. Right? If it's not necessarily false, then it could have been true. So keep in mind that necessity and possibility are interdefinable. Now, it's widely, though not universally, accepted by philosophers that modal claims, that is, claims of the form that it is necessary that such and such, or it is possible that such and such, are themselves either necessarily true or necessarily false. So, for example, it is necessary that 2 + 2 = 4. And furthermore, it is necessary that it's possible that I had cereal for breakfast. It's also widely, but not universally accepted by philosophers, that if it's possible that it's necessary that such and such, then it's simply necessary simpliciter that such and such. If you want a relatively intuitive gloss of this inference from possibly necessary to necessary, I recommend checking out my user's guide to the modal ontological argument video. For present purposes, though, what I've said here suffices. So, given all the preceding claims about necessity, contingency, possibility, and actuality, we can construct an argument for the existence of God. The core idea behind the argument is that God's existence cannot be a contingent matter. Either it's necessary that God exists, or it's impossible that God exists. The idea is that were God to exist, God would be a necessary being, and so he either spans all possible worlds, or he spans no possible worlds. If he exists in any possible world, then he's going to have to exist in all possible worlds, and likewise, if he doesn't exist in some possible world, then he doesn't exist in any possible world. So God's existence is either going to be necessary, he's either going to span all possible worlds, all comprehensive or total ways that reality could be, or else he's going to be impossible, he's going to span no possible worlds. So given that God's existence cannot be a contingent matter, given that God's existence is either necessary or impossible, if it's possible that God exists, well then clearly it's not impossible that God exists, and hence it's going to have to be necessary that God exists. And then of course it follows that God actually exists. This, in short, is the simplest way to present the modal ontological argument. Now, is this a proof of God's existence? Definitely not. Yes, if we grant that God's existence cannot be a contingent matter, and if we grant the background system of modal logic, then either it's necessary that God exists, or it's impossible that God exists. So under those assumptions, the second premise of the argument is on good footing. The problem, though, is that there's an equally compelling reverse modal ontological argument, whose conclusion is incompatible with the conclusion of the modal ontological argument. In particular, if it's possible that God doesn't exist, if God's non-existence is possible, then it follows that God's existence is not necessary, right? If God's non-existence is possible, if it's possible that God doesn't exist, then clearly God's existence is not absolutely necessary. And so from 1 and 2, we can conclude that God's existence is impossible, right? Because if God's non-existence is possible, then God's existence isn't necessary, and hence God's existence is going to have to be impossible. So, from the mere possibility that God doesn't exist, we can infer that God is impossible. And of course from that it follows that God actually doesn't exist. And we therefore have two seemingly equally compelling arguments on our hands. The original modal ontological argument and the reverse modal ontological argument. They share a second premise. Their conclusions are incompatible. So it all goes down to the first premise. God's existence is possible versus God's non-existence is possible. So then, given that God's existence cannot be a contingent matter, there are only two available positions. On the one side, there's the view that says that God possibly exists, and hence necessarily exists, and so actually exists. And on the other side, there's the view that says that God possibly doesn't exist, and hence necessarily doesn't exist, and so actually doesn't exist. It would be an obvious error to suppose that one of these two arguments constitutes a proof of one of these two positions, right? There's a symmetry between the first premises of the arguments, and this symmetry obviously isn't broken by the arguments themselves, right? These arguments themselves, therefore, give us no reason whatsoever to prefer one possibility premise over the other. Since the premises are incompatible, and since the arguments give us no reason to prefer one over the other, it's clear that neither argument gives us a reason to accept its conclusion over the other incompatible conclusion. In other words, both arguments rather overtly fail to prove or disprove God's existence. They make literally no headway whatsoever in the dispute between atheism and theism. Another way to put the symmetry problem is that, quite clearly, if you're not already a theist, you won't grant that the original possibility premise is more acceptable than the reverse possibility premise, and so the modal ontological argument then makes no headway in the dispute between theists and non-theists, right? Only those who antecedently accept theism are in a position to accept this original possibility premise over the reverse possibility premise, and hence the argument is powerless to give non-theists reason to accept theism. In itself, then, that is, without the aid of supplemental symmetry breakers between these first two premises, that is, reasons that differentially and uniquely support exactly one of them, so in itself, without such symmetry breakers, the modal ontological argument quite clearly fails. Now, for those curious about symmetry breakers, that is, reasons that purportedly favor exactly one of these possibility premises over the other, I do recommend checking out my user's guide to the modal ontological argument. I also recommend checking out my analysis article, just published, entitled Symmetry's Revenge, and finally stay tuned for a very special video on symmetry breakers later this year. I'll be making a video systematically examining basically every single symmetry breaker in existence. The video will be based on an exciting project of mine, the details of which will be available later. Well, actually, the details have already been made public, but oh well. Anyway, so much then for the modal ontological argument. The final ontological argument we'll examine here is a Gödelian, or higher-order ontological argument, which requires more complex logical machinery than the other ontological arguments. While the leading ideas behind higher-order ontological arguments date back to Leibniz, the first careful formulation thereof is due to Kurt Gödel, arguably the greatest logician who ever lived. Gödel formulated his argument in about 1941, and unofficial versions began to circulate in the 1970s. The past 30 years has seen intensive study of higher-order ontological arguments, and, following Oppie, I'll do my best to give an intelligible presentation of a simple higher-order ontological argument. The most fundamental notion in higher-order ontological arguments is the notion of a property. Things have properties. There is a cup on my table here. You can't see it, but there's a cup. And it has the property of being blue, or equivalently, the property of blueness. When I say that my cup is blue, I can be taken to be attributing the property of being blue, or equivalently, the property of blueness, to my cup. Philosophers differ in their attitudes towards talk of properties. Some believe that there are properties, others don't. Presentations of higher-order ontological arguments generally take it for granted that there are properties, though the arguments could probably be run in terms of predicates, too. For present purposes, let's just proceed with the property formulations. Given that there are properties, there are different kinds of properties and different ways in which things can possess properties. In particular, for any given thing, we can distinguish between its essential properties, the properties it cannot fail to have if it exists, from its accidental properties, the properties that it could fail to have while yet existing. While, if my life had gone differently, I might not have had the property of loving philosophy, so that loving philosophy is one of my accidental properties, no matter how my life went, I would have been a human being, an occupant of space-time, and larger than an electron. And hence these are all among my essential properties. They're properties that I cannot fail to have if I exist. Now, for various reasons here, we're going to make a transition away from my PowerPoint presentation and to a kind of document-style presentation. The main reason is that that's going to be the way that I can most clearly and carefully and cogently present the higher-order ontological argument. So onwards we march to the document. So our simple higher-order ontological argument begins with the idea of a positive property. Intuitively, the positive properties are God's essential properties, the properties that God must have if God exists. Candidate examples include omnipotence, omniscience, perfect goodness, and necessary existence. We then make two assumptions about positive properties. One, if a property A is positive, then the negation of that property is not positive. So the negation of a property A is the property not A, had by exactly everything that does not have the property A. For example, the negation of the property of being blue is the property of not being blue. So this is saying that if a property A is positive, then the negation of that property is not positive. The second assumption about positive properties is that if a property A is positive, and property A entails property B, then property B is positive. Just as an aside, you could also articulate this assumption in terms of the failure of positive properties to entail negative properties. You could just say for any property A, if property A is positive, then property A doesn't entail a negative property for any negative property, but that doesn't really change much of substance going forward. So all the same criticisms, mutatis mutandis, would arise for that formulation of this second assumption. But we're just going to stick with how Gramapi articulated it in his piece. So you can think of that as saying that positive properties only entail positive properties. Note that a property A entails a property B, just in case, necessarily, everything that has property A has property B. So, for example, the property of being blue entails the property of being colored. Necessarily, everything that has the property of being blue also has the property of being colored. To put it differently, but equivalently, it's impossible for something to have the property of being blue, but not have the property of being colored. That's just the same as saying that necessarily, everything that has the property of being blue also has the property of being colored. You're basically saying it's impossible that something both has the property of being blue, but fails to have the property of being colored. We can make one further definition. A thing is godlike just in case the essential properties of that thing are exactly the positive properties. So all and only the positive properties are the essential properties of this thing. And then we introduce two new assumptions. 3, the property of being godlike is positive, and 4, the property of existing necessarily is positive. Now, the key to our simple higher-order ontological argument is the following. Given 1 and 2, which I've repasted down here, given 1 and 2, any pair of positive properties is such that it's possible for something to have them both. So, for example, given that being godlike and existing necessarily are positive, it's possible for there to be something that is both godlike and necessarily existent. And then we argue for this key claim as follows. Suppose that properties A and B are both positive, and suppose further that it's not possible for there to be something that is both A and B. Well then, necessarily, everything that has A does not have B, right? If it's not possible for there to be something that is both A and B, then necessarily, whatever has A does not also have B. What that means then is that A entails not B. But by 2, if a property A is positive and a property A entails property B, then property B is positive. And so by 2, this means that not B is positive, right? We just said that A entails not B, and we know that A is positive, and given 2, if a property A is positive and property A entails some other property, then that other property is positive, and so we know that not B is positive. But that, of course, contradicts 1 up here, right? If a property is positive, then the negation of that property is not positive. We suppose that B is a positive property, but we just concluded that the negation of B is positive, and so that contradicts 1. B is positive, and yet the negation of it is still positive, even though 1 says that it wouldn't be positive. And so we just got a contradiction. And so, given that A and B are positive, we derived a contradiction from the assumption that it's not possible for there to be something that is both A and B. And so our assumption for reductio is mistaken. It is possible for there to be something that is both A and B. So, given that A and B are positive, it simply follows that it's possible for there to be something that is both A and B. And so what that tells us, because A and B were just arbitrarily chosen positive properties, that tells us that any pair of positive properties is such that it's possible for something to have them both. And so, given that being godlike and existing necessarily are positive, it's possible for there to be something that is both godlike and necessarily existent. In other words, it's possible for there to be a necessary being whose essential properties are all and only the positive properties, like omniscience and omnipotence and so on. And then the rest of the argument you can kind of see now is straightforward, and it follows the path of the modal ontological argument that we discussed earlier. Right? We just concluded that it's possible for there to be something that is both godlike and necessarily existent. Since it's possible that it necessarily exists, it follows that it actually exists, right? Something that's possibly necessary is just necessary given system S5 of modal logic. And if it's necessarily existent, then it follows that it actually exists. And since it's godlike, it has all of the positive properties essentially, which means that it actually has these properties. So there is something that is necessarily existent, essentially omnipotent, essentially omniscient, essentially perfectly good, etc. In other words, God exists. So then we can ask, is this higher order ontological argument a successful proof of the existence of God? Unfortunately, not. To see why not, we need to note the following fact. Properties that are not possibly instantiated entail all properties. If nothing can have property A, then for any property B, A entails B. To put it differently, impossible properties entail every property. Here's how we can see this. A property P entails a property Q if and only if it's impossible for something to have P and fail to have Q. But clearly, if it's impossible for something to have P, then it's also impossible for something to both have P and fail to have Q for any Q, right? And so if a property is impossible, it entails every other property, right? Remember, a property P entails a property Q. What that means is that necessarily anything that has P also has property Q. And that's just to say that it's impossible for something to have P and yet fail to have Q. That's what it means for a property P to entail a property Q. But if it's impossible for something to have P, then clearly it's impossible for something to both have P and fail to have Q. Right? If it's impossible to be a square circle, then clearly it's impossible to be a square circle and fail to have another property Q for any other property Q. And so you can plug in any Q you want if P is indeed impossible. It's still going to meet this condition. It's going to meet this condition that it's impossible for something to both have P and fail to have Q for any Q that you plug in, simply because it's impossible for anything to have P in the first place. And what that means is that when a property P is impossible, that is, when it's impossible for something to have P, well then no matter what you plug into Q, P is going to entail Q. Because it's always going to be true that it's impossible for something to both have P and fail to have Q, no matter what you plug in for Q, so long as it's impossible for something to have P. So if a property is impossible, then it entails every property. Another way to see this, by the way, is to reflect on the truth conditions for implications. Implications are claims of the form if P then Q, so like if something has a property, then it has another property. That's an implication. An implication of the form if P then Q is false exactly when the antecedent P is true, but the consequent Q is false. Right, to see that, suppose that I say, as your teacher, if you get a 90% or more on this test, I'll give you an A. Now, under what conditions is what I just said false? Well, it's exactly under the conditions in which you do in fact get a 90% or more on the test, but I don't go on to give you an A, right? That would falsify what I said. But anything else wouldn't falsify what I said. Right? If you didn't get a 90% or more on the test, that wouldn't falsify what I said. If I give you an A, that's not going to falsify what I said, even if you get less than a 90%. Right? This is not saying that if you get less than a 90%, then I won't give you an A. So the only conditions under which what I say here is falsified are the conditions in which you do in fact get a 90% or more on the test, and yet I don't give you an A. So the only circumstances in which this conditional as a whole is false are the conditions in which the antecedent is true, that is, in which you get a 90% or more on the test, and yet the consequent is false. That is, I fail to give you an A. I don't actually give you an A. So, again, an implication of the form if P then Q is false exactly when the antecedent, P, the if part, is true, but yet the consequent, the then part, is false. Hence, whenever the antecedent of an implication is false, the implication as a whole is going to be true, regardless of what the implication's consequent says. If an implication is false exactly when the antecedent is true, but the consequent is false, well, when the antecedent is false, this condition isn't met, right? And if this condition isn't met, then the implication is not going to be false. Instead, it's going to be true. And so whenever the antecedent of an implication is false, the implication as a whole is true, regardless of what the implication's consequent says. As a result, whenever the antecedent of an implication is necessarily false, the implication as a whole is necessarily true, regardless of what the implication's consequent says. So, whenever the antecedent of any implication asserts that something instantiates an impossible property, the antecedent of that implication is necessarily false, right? Because it's necessarily false that something instantiates an impossible property. The property is literally impossible. And as a result, the implication as a whole will always be necessarily true in these circumstances. And so any implication whose antecedent asserts that something instantiates an impossible property will be necessarily true regardless of what the implication's consequent says. And thus, if it's impossible for something to have P, then the implication, the conditional statement, if something has P, then something has Q, will be necessarily true for any Q. And that is to say that an impossible property entails every property. So again, we're asking whether this higher-order ontological argument is a successful proof of God's existence. And we needed to note first that properties that are not possibly instantiated entail all properties. In other words, impossible properties entail every property. And this is going to be important for assessing whether or not this higher-order ontological argument succeeds. And here's why. Consider a view according to which it is necessary that no godlike thing exists. Necessarily, nothing is omnipotent. Necessarily, nothing is omniscient. Necessarily, nothing is perfectly good, etc. Focus in particular on omnipotence. If it's necessary that nothing is omnipotent, then for any property at all, it's necessary that anything that is omnipotent has that property. Right? Remember, impossible properties entail every property. So, in particular, it's necessary that anything that is omnipotent is not omnipotent. And so, being omnipotent entails not being omnipotent. So, given 1 and 2 from earlier, right, it cannot be that the property of being omnipotent is positive, right? Suppose that the property of being omnipotent is positive. Well, we know that if a property is positive, then its negation is not positive. And so then, if being omnipotent is positive, then the property not being omnipotent is not positive. But we just concluded, remember, that being omnipotent entails not being omnipotent. And yet that contradicts 2, right? 2 says that if a property is positive and entails another property, then that other property is positive as well. But we just concluded that omnipotence is positive, entails not being omnipotent, and yet not being omnipotent is not positive, and so we contradict 2 here. So on the assumption that the property of being omnipotent is positive, we get a contradiction, and so it cannot be that the property of being omnipotent is positive. Again, we're assuming as background that it's necessary that nothing is omnipotent. So the structure of the reasoning here, again, is that if it's necessary that nothing is omnipotent, that is, if omnipotence is impossible, then omnipotence cannot be a positive property. And the reason, in short, is that if omnipotence is impossible, then omnipotence, remember, impossible properties entail every property. And so if omnipotence is impossible, then omnipotence entails every property, including not being omnipotent. But then omnipotence can't be positive, right? Because if it were positive, then anything entailed by it would be positive. But we just concluded that not being omnipotent is entailed by it, and so not being omnipotent would be positive as well. But then both omnipotence and not being omnipotent would be both positive, and yet that contradicts 1. 1 says that if a property is positive, then its negation is not positive, and yet we just concluded that omnipotence and its negation are both positive. And so if it is indeed the case that omnipotence is impossible, then omnipotence cannot be a positive property, because assuming that it is a positive property lands us in that contradiction. What we learned then is that whether the property of being omnipotent is positive stands or falls with whether it's possibly instantiated. If it's impossible, if omnipotence is not possibly instantiated, then it's not going to be positive. But then we can't use the assumption that omnipotence is positive to prove that it's possibly instantiated. And likewise for the assumptions that godlikeness and necessary existence are positive. To assert that they're positive, given the conditions laid down on positive properties, just amounts to asserting that they're possible. Right? We just concluded above that if omnipotence is impossible, then omnipotence is not, after all, positive. And so to assert that it is indeed positive is just to assert that omnipotence is indeed possible. So to assert that they're positive, given the conditions laid down on positive properties, just amounts to asserting that they're possible. Anyone inclined to doubt their possibility, then, will ipso facto be inclined to doubt their positivity. And so no headway is made in the dispute between those who think they're possible and those who think they're not possible when the former individuals insist on their positivity. Since non-theists are precisely those inclined to doubt that godlikeness and necessary existence are both possible, no headway is made in the dispute between theists and atheists when theists insist that godlikeness and necessary existence are positive. Again, because to insist on that is essentially to insist that these things are possible, and yet that's precisely what non-theists reject. They don't think that they're both possible. A fortiori, they don't think that these are positive properties, because a condition on a positive property is being possible. And so then to assert that they're positive is, in essence, just to assert that the non-theists are mistaken. And of course, that doesn't give them any reason to abandon their view, just to assert that they're mistaken in their view. So the ultimate conclusion here is that In essence, the non-theist hasn't been given any reason to abandon their view. Only those who aren't inclined to doubt the possibility of godlikeness and necessary existence, that is, only those who are theists, are going to be in a position to accept that godlikeness and necessary existence are positive, because a condition on being a positive property is possibility. And so the argument, in short, doesn't give non-theists any reason to become theists. That's the basic thrust of this criticism. Here's a different way to see the overarching point here. Granting the two conditions laid down on positive properties, right, the two conditions that I bolded, 1 and 2 here, I hereby mount a Gödelian ontological argument for atheism. It just has one premise in addition to those two conditions laid down on positive properties. The property of knowing God doesn't exist is positive. Now, if 5 is true, then possibly God doesn't exist, right? Here's why. Recall that any positive property is possible, right? For if the property were not possible, then it would entail every property, including its own negation. But any property entailed by a positive property is positive, per 2. And so if a property were not possible and positive, then, since it entails its own negation, and anything entailed by a positive property is positive, it follows that the property's negation is positive. But that contradicts 1, right? If a property is positive, its negation is not positive. Hence, no property can be both not possible and positive. In which case, any positive property is possible. We've already gone through this reasoning, but I just wanted to reiterate it here. Any positive property is possible. A condition on being a positive property is being possible. But given 5, right, the property of knowing God doesn't exist is positive, and hence it follows that the property of knowing God doesn't exist is possible. It's possibly instantiated. But crucially, any world in which that property is instantiated is a world in which God doesn't exist, right? Knowing God doesn't exist entails that God doesn't exist. You can't know something that's not true. So if the property of knowing God doesn't exist is possible, then there's a possible world in which that property is instantiated, in which someone really does know that God doesn't exist. But knowledge entails truth. You can't know something that's not true, and so it follows that there's a possible world in which God doesn't exist. In other words, God's non-existence is possible. And we already know from the modal ontological argument that God's possible non-existence entails God's actual non-existence. And note, too, that this part of the modal ontological argument is common to the higher order ontological argument presently under consideration. Hence, from all the preceding, we conclude that God doesn't exist. Now, clearly, theists won't accept this argument. Equally clearly, they're going to reject that claim 5 up here, that the property of knowing God doesn't exist is positive. So equally clearly, they're going to reject 5, precisely because they don't think the property of knowing God doesn't exist is even possible in the first place. Since they deny that it's possible, they thereby deny that it's positive, and hence they thereby deny 5. No headway is made in the dispute between non-theists and theists, then, by the non-theist insisting on the truth of 5. Theists will rightly reject 5 by dint of rejecting the possibility of the instantiation of the property specified therein. And yet that's precisely what the non-theist is doing in responding to the theist's higher-order ontological argument. Non-theists will rightly reject the conjunction of 3 and 4 by dint of rejecting the possibility of the joint instantiation of the properties specified therein, namely godlikeness, or being godlike, and necessary existence. Once more, then, no headway is made in the dispute between theists and non-theists by the theist insisting on the truth of 3 and 4. So that's a kind of illustration that I hope will help people see the force of the criticism being leveled here. Just as theists would never grant premise 5 here, precisely because they don't think that this property is possible, and since possibility is a condition on being positive, they reject that this property here is positive, and so this argument gives theists no reason to adopt atheism. So too, non-theists will simply reject the conjunction of these two here, precisely because they don't think that that conjunction of properties is possible. They don't even think that it's possibly instantiated in the first place. And since possibility is a condition on being positive, they also don't accept that these properties are both positive. And so merely including these as premises in an argument doesn't give them any reason to abandon their position and to adopt theism, just as 5 here doesn't give the theist any reason to abandon theism and adopt atheism. So one might be thinking, whatever else a positive property is, it's supposed to be something like a great-making feature. Intuitively, it's a feature that's better to have than lack. It contributes to the greatness of its bearer. Furthermore, one might argue that we can set modal considerations aside and simply ask whether, intuitively, a being is greater if it's omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, necessarily existent, and so on. In short, if it's godlike. And, intuitively, it seems like being godlike is indeed a great-making feature. Setting aside whether it's possible, if there were a godlike being, it would be supremely great in virtue of being godlike. So, intuitively, being godlike is a great-making feature, and hence intuitively it's a positive property. So the suggested avenue of response that I've given here for the non-theist namely denying that both being godlike and being necessarily existent are positive properties, doesn't actually seem to be a good response. So here I'm sort of defending the proponent of the Gödelian ontological argument. They're basically saying, hey, intuitively, being godlike is a feature that's better to have than lack. Set aside the modal consideration, set aside whether or not it's possible. It still seems intuitively like a great-making feature, such that, like, were something to be godlike, setting aside whether or not that's a possible antecedent, right? Were something to be godlike, it would be, in virtue of that, very, very great. It would be supremely great, in fact. And so intuitively, being godlike is a great-making feature, setting aside whether or not it's possible. And so intuitively, it's a positive property. And so the response that I've suggested on behalf of the non-theist, namely that it just falls out of their commitments that these are not positive properties, is basically saddling them with a deeply unintuitive view, so the thought goes. And so it's not costless to reject the argument. And the argument doesn't, like, problematically question beg against them because the premises are just, like, obvious or something like that. So even if the non-theist is committed to rejecting the premises, well, that just means they're committed to rejecting something obvious. So the thought goes. By my lights, though, that response doesn't succeed. In my view, the response only relocates the problem. It doesn't resolve it. If this is our conception of positive properties, namely those properties that, setting aside whether they're possible, are great-making and so include being godlike, well, then the non-theist would never grant that positive properties only entail positive properties, right? That is, the non-theist would never grant, too, that positive properties only entail positive properties, right? Remember, too. The reason is that the non-theist thinks that some positive properties, so construed, that is, so construed as setting aside whether or not the properties in question are possible, they nevertheless intuitively seem great-making. The reason is that the non-theist thinks that some positive properties, so construed, aren't even possible in the first place, right? This we already know from the modal ontological argument. The non-theist is committed to God's impossibility, and hence is committed to the impossibility of the property of being godlike. But then it simply falls out of the non-theist's commitments that being godlike entails every property, including negative properties, or at least properties that aren't positive. Remember, impossible properties entail every property. So again, the non-theist thinks that being godlike entails every property, including negative properties. Since the non-theist will agree, we can suppose that being godlike is a positive property, given the response's understanding of positive properties. The non-theist rejects that positive properties only entail positive properties, right? They think that being godlike is positive because, yeah, sure, it's intuitively great-making, setting aside modal considerations. They will agree then that being godlike is positive, but precisely because they think that being godlike is impossible, it's going to entail every property, including negative properties. And so they reject that positive properties only entail positive properties. No, here's a positive property, being godlike, and that entails every property because it's impossible. And if it entails every property, then it entails negative properties, and so it doesn't only entail positive properties. And so it's just false to say, by the non-theist's lights, that positive properties only entail positive properties. So then, to assert that positive properties only entail positive properties just amounts to denying the non-theist's position. Anyone inclined to doubt the possibility of being godlike will ipso facto be inclined to doubt that positive properties only entail positive properties, granting, of course, the response's understanding of positive properties. Thus, no headway is made in the dispute between those who think being godlike is possible and those who think that it's not possible, when the former individuals insist on the claim that positive properties only entail positive properties. Since non-theists are precisely those inclined to doubt that being godlike is possible, no headway is made in the dispute between theists and non-theists when theists insist that positive properties only entail positive properties. In short, then, I think the response has simply shifted the dialectical impropriety. It has not removed it. And again, all the same points apply, by the way, if we change to the claim that positive properties do not entail negative properties, where a negative property is intuitively a property that, like, detracts from something's greatness, or, like, it's like a worse-making property. Now, I think all these considerations point to a dialectical dilemma for Gödelian ontological arguments. We either take the possibility of a property as a necessary condition on that property's being positive, or we don't. If we take the possibility of a property as a necessary condition on that property's being positive, then non-theists would never grant that being godlike is positive, precisely because they deny that being godlike is possible. In that case, it is dialectically inappropriate to assert the positivity of being godlike. Only those inclined to theism will grant that premise, and so it makes no headway in the dispute between theists and non-theists. By contrast, if we don't take the possibility of a property as a necessary condition on that property's being positive, and, say, instead construe positive properties intuitively as great-making features, properties that would make their bearers great whether or not those properties are possible, then while being godlike will turn out to be positive, the non-theist would never grant that positive properties only entail positive properties, precisely because they deny that being godlike is possible, and hence think that being godlike entails every property, including negative properties. In that case, it is dialectically inappropriate to assert that positive properties only entail positive properties. Only those inclined to theism will grant that premise, and so it makes no headway in the dispute between theists and non-theists. In fact, perhaps this second horn of the dilemma actually concedes too much to the proponent of the Gödelian ontological argument. Now, I still think, at least by my lights, and at least prima facie, that this dilemma is a successful response, a successful dialectical criticism of Gödelian ontological arguments, but perhaps, actually, this second horn of the dilemma is conceding too much, even still, to the proponent of Gödelian ontological arguments. Even assuming the intuitive understanding of positive properties as great-making features, perhaps we should still think that claiming that being godlike is positive problematically begs the question against the atheist. More generally, even under that assumption, right? Even under that assumption that positive properties are kind of construed intuitively as great-making features, perhaps we should still think that claiming any property necessarily unique to God is positive problematically begs the question against the atheist. And by the way, when I say property that's necessarily unique to God, I mean any property that only God could instantiate. So again, perhaps even granting that intuitive understanding of positive properties as great-making features, perhaps we should still think that claiming that any property that's necessarily unique to God is positive, perhaps we should still think that that claim problematically begs the question against the atheist, and here's why. So we know from the modal ontological argument that atheists are committed to God's impossibility, while theists are committed to God's necessity, assuming, of course, that God would be a necessary being, and assuming S5, etc. And again, those aspects of the modal ontological argument are shared between the Gödelian ontological argument and the modal ontological argument. So, we know from the modal ontological argument that atheists are committed to God's impossibility. We therefore know that atheists are committed to the impossibility in the sense of necessary non-instantiation of any property necessarily unique to God. That is, any property that only God could instantiate, such as the properties being perfect, being God, being godlike, and so on down the list. Given the notion of entailment at play, that is, P entails Q if and only if, necessarily, anything that instantiates P also instantiates Q, it follows that atheists are committed to the claim that any property necessarily unique to God entails Q, for any property Q. But then it seems self-evident to me that the atheist is thereby committed to the claim that no property necessarily unique to God is positive. And there are lots of ways to appreciate that. First, pick some property necessarily unique to God, P. Since the atheist takes P to be impossible, the atheist takes having P to entail having Q, for any Q. But then having P entails having the property being such that P isn't positive. But surely any property the instantiation of which entails its own non-positivity is itself not positive, right? I'm just working with this intuitive understanding of positive properties as intuitively great-making properties. But any property the instantiation of which entails that it itself is not a great-making property does not seem to be a great-making property. Just intuitively, my conception of great-making properties, just intuitively, that seems obvious. Whatever else a great-making property is, it shouldn't entail that it itself is not a great-making property. Hence, by the atheist's lights, P isn't positive. Hence, by the atheist's lights, no property necessarily unique to God is positive. And you can kind of see why this is saying that the dilemma above, the second horn of that dilemma, is conceding too much to the proponent of Gödelian ontological arguments, right? Remember, this second horn of the dilemma is basically granting, okay, fine, then while being godlike may turn out to be positive, the non-theist will still never grant a certain premise in the argument, and so that asserting that premise is kind of dialectically infelicitous. But actually, these criticisms that I'm going on here are saying, actually, you know what? Actually, no. By the atheist's lights, being godlike will not actually, after all, turn out to be positive. No property necessarily unique to God will turn out to be positive. And that's working with precisely this intuitive conception of positive properties as great-making features. So it's a slightly different, but perhaps slightly more powerful criticism of Gödelian ontological arguments here. But anyway, continuing on with the second reason why the atheist is committed to the claim that no property necessarily unique to God is positive, here's a second one. Secondly, using the same reasoning and abbreviations as 1, having P also entails having not P. And since having P also entails having P entails both having P and having not P, which is a contradiction. But surely any property, the instantiation of which literally entails a contradiction, isn't a positive property, right? That's just my conception of an intuitively great-making property. If a property literally entails a contradiction, that does not seem to be a great-making property. It doesn't seem to contribute to or add to the greatness of the being which has it. in some manner, it brings with it a contradiction. It makes the being contradictory in some way. And if that's the case, well, then intuitively, the property doesn't seem to be gray-making. So again, surely any property the instantiation of which entails a contradiction isn't positive. Hence, by the atheist's lights, P isn't positive. And hence, by the atheist's lights, no property necessarily unique to God is positive. Thirdly, using the same reasoning and abbreviations as 1, having P also entails having the properties being vile, being disgusting, being wicked, being evil, being murderous, being sexist, being racist, being hateful, and being spiteful. But surely, if a property P is such that anything that instantiates that property also instantiates the properties being vile, being disgusting, etc., then P isn't positive. That's not a great-making property intuitively. Hence, by the atheist's lights, P isn't positive. And so, by the atheist's lights, no property necessarily unique to God is positive. Fourthly, using the same reasoning and abbreviations as 1, having P also entails having the properties being such that P is identical to the property of being vile, being such that P is identical to the property of being wicked, etc. But surely, a property P, which entails its own numerical identity with self-evidently negative properties, is not itself positive. Hence, by the atheist's lights, P is not positive. And so, by the atheist's lights, no property necessarily unique to God is positive. And then fifthly, as the Gödelian ontological argument itself requires, and as we can assume that the atheist grants as a constitutive condition on positivity, positive properties don't entail negative properties. But by the atheist's lights, any property necessarily unique to God entails everything. We already saw that, including negative properties. Hence, by the atheist's lights, no property necessarily unique to God is positive. Reflecting on these considerations and more leads me to think that asserting the positivity of some property necessarily unique to God is simply question-begging against the atheist, right? By the atheist's lights, no property necessarily unique to God can be positive. To assert, then, that some property necessarily unique to God is positive is to simply assert that the atheist is wrong. And no such assertion gives the atheist any reason to abandon their position. So in addition to the variegated dialectical criticisms developed here of Gödelian ontological arguments, there are other worries for Gödelian ontological arguments that you guys should be aware of. For starters, they arguably presuppose the existence of stance-independent moral facts, since committing to the positivity of certain properties arguably implies some kind of positive moral value or greatness of those properties. And furthermore, the truth value of the positivity claims in the Gödelian ontological argument are not supposed to be dependent on our preferences or desires or beliefs or other attitudes. So, arguably, Gödelian ontological arguments presuppose the existence of stance-independent moral facts. And of course, whether there are stance-independent moral facts is quite controversial. There we go. Now, let's just show the stuff about response to gettings. Another, in my view, more powerful criticism develops parody arguments for absurd conclusions by slightly tweaking the notion of positivity at play. For a rigorous and systematically worked out Gödelian parody argument, which constitutes quite a powerful response in its own right to Gödelian ontological arguments, check out Graham Oppy's article entitled Response to Gettings, published in Analysis in 2000. Link to a free version of that is in the description. Finally, for a more in-depth critical assessment of Gödelian ontological arguments, check out my videos Graham Oppy Responds to Josh Rasmussen's ontological argument and 4 ontological arguments in 12 minutes, as well as the 2.5-page section entitled A Simple Higher Order Argument of Graham Oppy's wonderful 2017 article on ontological arguments, which, by the way, is different from the article that formed the basis of much of this video that you're currently watching. Again, links to all this stuff will be in the description. And you know what else will be linked in the description? My Patreon, and also PayPal for a one-time donation. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider becoming a patron or making a one-time donation. Any amount truly helps. It helps me through grad school. It helps keep me alive. You are basically the wind in my sails, so thank you so much for all of your support. As always, please smash that like button, subscribe, turn on that little bell for notifications, and most importantly, share. Share this with your friends. If you have a friend who thinks ontological arguments succeed, share this video with them and say, hey, they probably don't. And as always, what better way to end is there than, I'm Joe Schmidt, this is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.
I remember they first came in that room filled with sun rays, rich in jewels as intake. Therefore the smiley faces from these sliding, gliding, grinding ladies. That vaguely had me gaping like a spaceman looks at human faces. Then you got right in the corner of my eyes, getting rendered on my retina printer, saved inside my memory card with a rhythm for my heart, more than visibly off the charts. So heartfelt, the ideal, all cars I held, smart, don't really got like I try to stay far from sacrificing, but that day I'd give my life to get a slice of those full up just stars. Easily top 5 I'd ever eye with an effortless grander victory. Only mostly cause I got mesmerized by your Atlantic eyes. We left me stranded like poetry when I dove inside to read your constellations, looking for conversation. Mainly maybe some fornication with your mind.
She took the funk out of my soul. My rhythm is bruising. I see the moods that you've been swinging over me. Got me mountains we can climb together. I'll share my standing in your way. Oh, it's the money that I can't pay. See, I just want it to be over, but I don't wanna get over you. I just want it to be over, but I don't wanna get over you. I just want it to be over, but I don't wanna get over you. I just want it to be over, but I don't wanna get over you.
You're an elusive, intrusive, seducing, destructive seductress. Exclusively misusing your power for me to see the truth. And remove Elise and leave all of my soul for the more. At least that's what I'm told before you start the show. You'd make me see and peek, maybe feel underneath your clothes. Being up the sun, seen that coming when you struck that pose. You know, tried to stay to play these games with you. Always knowing I was destined to fail with you.
She took the funk out of my soul. My rhythm is bruising. I see the moods that you've been swinging over me. Got me mountains we can climb together. I'll share my standing in your way. Oh, it's the money that I can't pay. See, I just want it to be over, but I don't wanna get over you. I just want it to be over, but I don't wanna get over you. I just want it to be over, but I don't wanna get over you. I just want it to be over, but I don't wanna get over you. She took the funk out of my soul. My rhythm is bruising. I see the moods that you've been swinging over me. Got me mountains we can climb together. I'll share my standing in your way. Oh, it's the money that I can't pay.
Raw, life, direct from the dome. It's the funk master blast you with ridiculous stone. We set the rhythm, the groove, and nothing to lose. Boxes all up in your face, hit like Dominic Cruz. We brought the jewels, the food to get your system improved. To get your head bop, the head bop what I try to induce. When I mix up, consume, leave the crowd with amazement. Once they sink through my frequency like radio stations. The flow, it's fire style, is gifted to show. It's just delivered, see you shiver from your flesh to the bone. Leave the speaker status blown when I get on the microphone. With them rhymes in my pocket, I pop it, I rock it, I own. Your energy, all I need to get you what you need. Every enemy tend to favor opposite. You dig it, you feel it right, which was the intention. Hey, thanks for being subject to my latest invention.
Seeing all night long, get things off my mind. And all I ever wanted was good life, good love. Can't get things off my mind. And all I ever wanted was what's good. What's good? And all I ever wanted was, all I ever wanted was you.
Give me a break. I got to go and get another debate. All this trouble on my mind, I gotta shake it. Kick it out the dome and get the blade. Push the gas, rep the engine, let it blast. Go and get my ass to class, make it fast, cause I'm trying to pass and twist every single plot on every single shot. Exceed them expectations as expected around the clock.